What would you do if you came home to find your prized maple tree being hacked apart by strangers, without your permission? That's exactly what happened to me, and trust me, I had no idea it was only the beginning of something much worse. I had just pulled into my driveway, tired from a long day, when I saw them, men in orange vests, wielding chainsaws, tearing into my tree like it was some disposable piece of firewood. My beautiful maple, the one that had shaded my home for 15 summers, was being butchered right before my eyes. The deafening roar of chainsaws drowned out my heartbeat as I slammed my car door and ran toward them, my pulse hammering. Stop! What are you doing to my tree? My voice cut through the noise, sharp with panic. The workers hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances, but before any of them could answer, a familiar figure stepped forward from the neighboring lawn. Arms crossed, a smug smile tugging at her lips, Karen Peterson, the self-appointed queen of our HOA, surveyed the destruction with an air of satisfaction. Finally, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Someone's taking care of this nightmare. I turned to her, fists clenched. Karen, this is my property. Who gave you the right to cut down my tree? She didn't even blink. The roots are cracking my driveway. The leaves clog my gutters every fall. It's been a nuisance for years. I ignored her and marched up to the worker who looked like he was in charge. Who authorized this? HOA approval, ma'am, he said flatly, handing me a wrinkled document with a stamped signature. Richard Thornton. Of course. HOA president, golf buddy of Karen's, and the man who had been making my life miserable with his ridiculous fines and rule changes for the past 2 years. My hands shook as I scanned the paper. Something about it felt off. I never got any notice about this, I said, my voice tight. We sent it 2 weeks ago, Karen chimed in, her fake sweetness making my teeth grind. Maybe if you checked your mail more often. Before I could argue, my phone buzzed. A text from my neighbor, Tom. Saw the tree crew. Did they finally wear you down? No, I hadn't been worn down. I had been blindsided. And this wasn't going to stand. I yanked my phone out to snap pictures, ready to fight this in every way I could. But before I could take a single shot, a sickening crack split the air. One of the half-cut branches, a massive limb thicker than my waist, gave way. The workers scrambled back as it crashed down directly onto Karen's prized white gazebo. The one she'd bragged about in 3 different neighborhood newsletters. The structure splintered like matchsticks, burying her expensive rose garden in a heap of shattered wood and leaves. Karen's shriek could have shattered glass. My gazebo. She whirled on me, her face turning an alarming shade of red. Do you see what your tree did? This is exactly why it needed to come down. I opened my mouth, but before I could respond, the crew chief let out a low whistle. That's gonna be expensive. Karen spun away from me and started tapping furiously on her phone. Richard will hear about this immediately. You'll be paying for every penny of damage. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Your friend Richard authorized cutting down my tree without my permission. If anyone's responsible for that branch falling, it's the people who weakened it by hacking at it improperly. Karen's eyes narrowed. We'll see what the board has to say about that. And just like that, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. Richard Thornton stepped out, smoothing the front of his polo shirt, clipboard already in hand. He barely glanced at the ruined gazebo before turning his sharp gaze on me. I clenched my jaw. I already knew, this wasn't just about my tree. It was about control. Richard Thornton took his time adjusting his clipboard, his expression calm, almost amused, like he had walked into a routine HOA dispute rather than a full-blown disaster. Karen wasted no time launching into her tirade, her voice shrill with righteous indignation. Richard, look at what that hazard did to my gazebo. I told you this tree was a menace. And now my property is destroyed. I expect full compensation immediately." Richard finally glanced at the pile of shattered wood and crushed roses, raising an unimpressed eyebrow before shifting his attention to me. "Ethan, I assume you're aware that HOA bylaws allow for the removal of hazardous trees at the board's discretion?" His voice was smooth, rehearsed. He'd done this before. I squared my shoulders. "That tree wasn't hazardous. It was healthy, and you know it. And you had no right to send people onto my property without notifying me." He sighed, flipping through his clipboard like he was indulging a child's tantrum. "A notice was sent," he said, tilting his head toward Karen. "Perhaps if you checked your mail more often." "That did it." "I check my mail just fine, Richard," I cut him off. "And funny enough, I actually did check it today, and there was a notice. Dated yesterday. So, tell me, how exactly was I supposed to fight this?" Karen's face twitched, but she kept her arms crossed. "It's not our fault if you don't stay on top of community matters," she said, voice dripping with fake politeness. "Maybe if you were more involved in HOA meetings, you wouldn't be caught off guard so often." I could feel my blood pressure rising. This wasn't just some administrative mistake, it was deliberate. They wanted this tree gone, and they wanted me to be powerless to stop it. "Well," Richard continued, unfazed by my anger, "regardless of the timing, the fact remains that the tree caused property damage. And as the property owner, you're financially responsible." Karen's lips curled into a satisfied smirk as she thrust her phone toward me. "I've already contacted the HOA's legal team. Expect a bill for at least $28,000. And I highly suggest you don't fight it, Ethan. The board is already discussing further actions against you." I wanted to laugh. "Further actions?" Richard tapped his clipboard. "Failure to comply with HOA directives could result in escalating fines and legal consequences. If those aren't handled in a timely manner, the board will have no choice but to place a lien on your home." My stomach dropped. That was the real threat. They weren't just fining me. They were setting me up to lose my house. Karen leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to something more intimate, more sinister. "Ethan, be reasonable. You can't fight the HOA. It's not personal, it's just how things are done. Now, if you'd like to resolve this quietly, there's a simple solution." She glanced back at her driveway, where a Mercedes with tinted windows sat gleaming in the sunlight. Beside it stood a man in a suit. "My cousin is in real estate," she continued smoothly. "He's prepared to offer you a way out. A clean sale. No lawsuits, no endless fines. Just a fresh start." I stared at her. "Are you serious?" Her eyes flickered, just for a second, with something close to amusement. "I am serious. Your house is already tainted by all this bad press. What with the lawsuit, the property damage, and now the environmental concerns." I narrowed my eyes. "Environmental concerns?" Richard cut in. "Yes. Some board members have raised questions about potential contamination from the roots. It's possible the tree was damaging underground water lines. Of course, nothing is confirmed, but, if that were the case, the cost of necessary repairs could be substantial. And if the city got involved." He trailed off, letting the unspoken threat linger. I clenched my jaw. They weren't just coming after my money. They were coming after my home. "Think about it," Karen added sweetly. "A clean sale now, or an ugly legal battle that leaves you bankrupt. Your choice." I didn't respond. I just turned on my heel, walked back inside, and slammed the door. But I wasn't giving up. That night, I dug through my filing cabinet until I found it, the original property survey from when I bought the house. I spread it out across my dining table, scanning every inch until my eyes landed on exactly what I was looking for. The tree had been 2 full feet inside my property line. They had no right to touch it. My phone buzzed. A new email. Subject line, lawsuit notice. I opened it and nearly dropped my phone. The HOA was suing me for $122,000. I had barely processed that when another notification popped up, a text from Tom. Saw something weird. Richard and some HOA guys were in your yard tonight. Looked like they were digging. My skin went cold. What the hell were they doing on my property now? I barely slept that night. Every noise outside sent me bolting upright, my heart pounding, half expecting to see Richard and his goons back in my yard with shovels. The moment the sun rose, I was outside, inspecting the ground where Tom said they had been digging. At first glance, everything looked undisturbed, until I noticed the subtle indentations in the soil near the stump of my tree. Small, circular holes, evenly spaced, like someone had been testing the ground. What the hell were they looking for? I snapped photos, then called Tom. Are you sure you saw them digging? Swear on my life, Tom said. I was up late, and I saw Richard and two of his cronies creeping around with flashlights. Looked like they were taking samples. Samples. Soil samples. My mind raced. Richard had made that offhand comment about environmental concerns. And the lawsuit? That ridiculous $122,000 claim wasn't just about Karen's gazebo. It included a suspiciously vague remediation fee for environmental hazards. A sick realization hit me. They were trying to frame me for something. I needed answers. By noon, I was sitting in the local police station across from Detective Lauren Rodriguez. She was younger than I expected, with sharp, no-nonsense eyes and a tone that said she had seen every kind of scam imaginable. I laid everything out, the tree, the fake fines, the mysterious digging in my yard. I even showed her the old property survey proving the HOA had no right to touch my tree. When I mentioned Richard and his company, her expression darkened. Thornton Construction, she asked. I nodded. You know them? Oh yeah. We've been watching Richard for a while. Overpriced HOA maintenance contracts, suspicious business dealings, and now you're telling me he's digging in your yard? That's new. She asked if she could take my photos and notes. I need to make some calls, she said. But if Richard is planting evidence, he's getting desperate. And desperate men make mistakes. An hour later, she called me back. You were right, she said. I checked with the city. There's no official environmental investigation on your property. But guess who submitted a private request for soil analysis last week? Richard, I said flatly. Bingo. He paid a private firm, one his company has used before, to test for possible water contamination. My stomach twisted. And if the tests come back positive? Then suddenly, your property is a public hazard. They could force you to sell, fine you into oblivion, even have your home condemned. And once you're out, guess what happens? Richard's development. His Westlake expansion. My land was in his way. I ran a hand over my face. How do I fight this? We need proof, she said. If he's faking contamination, we need to catch him in the act. And we need to find out how deep this goes. That night, I set up security cameras. I didn't care that the HOA had a rule against exterior cameras. I wasn't about to sit back while these people plotted to destroy me. And within 24 hours, I caught them. At 3:12 a.m., my motion sensor went off. I pulled up the live feed on my phone and there they were. Richard, two other HOA board members, and a man in a hazmat suit. They were digging again, this time, much deeper. One of them pulled out a handheld testing kit, studied the results, and nodded excitedly. Then Richard gave the man an envelope. A payoff. I felt sick. They weren't testing for contamination. They were faking it. The next morning, I called Detective Rodriguez. "I have footage," I said. "You're going to want to see this." She came over within the hour. As she watched the video, her jaw tightened. "This is worse than I thought," she muttered. "If they're staging contamination, this isn't just an HOA dispute. This is fraud." I exhaled. "What now?" She took a deep breath. "I need to loop in the feds. Richard's company operates in multiple states. If he's running this scam here, chances are, he's done it elsewhere." I stared at her. "The FBI?" She nodded. "We need a full financial audit of the HOA. If I'm right, they've been stealing from you all for years." As she left, my phone buzzed again. An unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. A low voice said, "Check your property survey." Then the line went dead. My stomach clenched. I rushed to my filing cabinet and pulled out the survey again, spreading it across the table. My tree had been inside my property line, but now I studied the full lot boundaries. And that's when I saw it, something I had overlooked before. My property backed up to the main stormwater runoff zone for Richard's Westlake project. If my land was labeled contaminated, the city would seize it. Not only would Richard avoid blame for environmental violations, but he'd get my property for free. I wasn't just a target. I was the final piece of his puzzle. By the time I arrived at the HOA's emergency meeting, the community center was packed. The air buzzed with tension. Neighbors who had ignored me for weeks now stole glances my way, whispering behind cupped hands. Karen sat in the front row, a smug smile plastered across her face, while Richard stood at the podium, flipping through a stack of neatly organized papers. The whole setup screamed pre-planned ambush. I took a deep breath and found a seat in the back. Detective Rodriguez had warned me not to react too soon. The FBI was watching. They needed Richard and Karen to dig their own graves first. Richard tapped the microphone, his voice calm and authoritative. "Good evening, neighbors. Thank you for coming on such short notice. We have an urgent matter regarding the health and safety of our beloved community." Behind him, a giant screen flickered to life, displaying a blown-up image of my house. A bold red label flashed underneath, "Toxic Property." My jaw clenched. They were going all in. Richard continued, flipping to another slide. Fake soil test results. A long list of fabricated environmental violations. Claims that my property was poisoning the neighborhood's water supply. "The results speak for themselves," Richard announced, shaking his head in mock regret. "And while we understand that Ethan Carter is a longtime resident, the truth is, his negligence has put all of us at risk." A few neighbors murmured in agreement. Others looked confused, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Karen stood up dramatically. "I have lived in this neighborhood for 15 years, she declared, her voice shaking just enough to sound believable. "I have never seen such reckless disregard for community safety. My poor roses, ruined. My gazebo, destroyed. My property value, plummeting." She sighed theatrically. "We cannot allow this kind of behavior to go unchecked." I tightened my grip on the table. It was a show. A carefully orchestrated script, designed to push the community into voting me out. Richard spread his arms. "Therefore, we propose an immediate community vote to determine whether Mr. Carter's property should be subject to forced HOA takeover. If passed, this will allow the HOA to reclaim his lot for environmental remediation and restore safety to our neighborhood." Forced takeover. They were trying to steal my house. A hush fell over the crowd. Neighbors shifted uneasily. Tom, sitting near the back, shot me a look of pure fury. That was my cue. I stood up. "Loud enough for the microphone to pick up," I said, "before anyone votes, let's talk about what this is really about." Richard frowned. "Mr. Carter, this meeting is not an open forum." I ignored him and pulled out my phone. My security footage. I tapped play, and the screen behind him flickered. There, in full HD clarity, was Richard sneaking into my yard with a hazmat-suited crony, digging holes, and handing off an envelope. The room exploded. Gasps. Shouts. Someone yelled, "Is that Richard?" I stepped forward. "That was taken 2 nights ago," I said, my voice steady. "What you're looking at is Richard Thornton faking environmental contamination on my property." A woman near the front turned to Richard. "Is that you?" He turned pale. "This is a ridiculous accusation." I held up another piece of evidence. "Here's the official city zoning record, showing that Richard's Westlake development needs a stormwater drainage solution. And guess what's in the way? My land." Murmurs turned into outright shouting. Karen jumped up. "This is absurd. That tree was a hazard. My driveway." I cut her off. "Karen, you bribed a fake city inspector to condemn my property. Should I play that footage too?" Karen's mouth snapped shut. The room erupted. More people stood up, demanding answers. Some even turned on Karen and Richard, calling them out for past fines, violations, and shady HOA decisions. Richard's face contorted with rage. "This meeting is over," he snapped, grabbing for his laptop. But he never made it to the exit. The main doors burst open. FBI agents swarmed the room. A woman in a dark suit stepped forward, flashing her badge. "Agent Priya Patel." "Richard Thornton," she said, her voice crisp and commanding. "You're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement." The crowd froze. 2 agents moved forward, snapping cuffs onto Richard's shaking hands. Karen stumbled back, knocking over a chair. "This is a mistake." Agent Patel cut her off. "Margaret Peterson, you're also under arrest. We have evidence of your involvement in falsifying city records and illegally seizing private property." Karen let out a horrified shriek as they pulled her hands behind her back. Neighbors watched in stunned silence as their once untouchable HOA leaders were dragged away in handcuffs. And just like that, the HOA's reign of terror was over. The community center slowly emptied as neighbors whispered among themselves, their expressions shifting from shock to realization. For years, Richard and Karen had ruled with an iron fist, weaponizing HOA rules to control, intimidate, and bleed homeowners dry. Now, they were the ones being led out in handcuffs, their empire crumbling in real time. I stepped outside, taking my first deep breath of fresh air in what felt like weeks. The night was still, eerily quiet compared to the chaos that had just unfolded inside. Tom walked up beside me, shaking his head with a low chuckle. "Well, I bet they didn't see that coming." A few other neighbors approached hesitantly, the same people who had once ignored my knocks, dodged my calls, or sent me judgmental glares during board meetings. But tonight, their expressions were different, some embarrassed, some apologetic, but mostly relieved. "I'm sorry," one woman muttered, clutching her purse. "I believed them when they said you were the problem." Another man ran a hand through his graying hair. "They fined me last year for leaving my trash bins out for an extra hour. Threatened to take me to collections over it. I should have fought back. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't need to. We had all been played." In the following weeks, everything unraveled even faster. The FBI's investigation uncovered that Richard's construction company had embezzled millions from multiple HOAs across the county, inflating maintenance costs, issuing bogus fines, and funneling money into shell accounts. Karen had been in on it the entire time, covering for Richard, silencing complaints, and bribing city officials like her husband to rubber stamp fraudulent projects. The lien on my house? Wiped clean. The lawsuit? Dismissed. The contamination claims? Exposed as a complete fraud. My property was never in violation of anything, and the only thing toxic had been the HOA's corruption. The community, once terrified into submission, took back control. Richard's board members were forced to resign, and in a rare moment of neighborhood unity, we voted to dissolve the HOA altogether. No more surprise fines. No more arbitrary rules. No more Karen. As I sat on my porch one evening, watching the last of the environmental hazard signs being pulled from my yard, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: peace. My home was mine again. The fight had been brutal, exhausting, but worth it. Tom, sitting beside me, took a long sip of his beer. "So," he said, smirking, "think we should plant another tree?" I laughed, shaking my head. "Not yet. Let's enjoy this victory first." But as much as I wanted to move on, I couldn't shake one final thought: how many other neighborhoods were still under HOA rule, dealing with their own Richard and Karen, without an FBI raid to save them? Have you ever felt powerless against an HOA, or a Karen, and had to fight back? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.